Hello, everybody. I am Ned Drummond. This is my second NACIS, and I'm excited to be here this year and get to talk to you. I am especially excited to share my series, 6 Feet Under, in which I'm using laser cut maps to visualize a hypothetical worst-case scenario sea level rise by 2100 under a high emission scenario, which is absolutely a mouthful. A little bit about me. For the past 7 years, have been working for the Pew Charitable Trusts, where I started as a graphic designer and an illustrator. But for the past 2 years or so, I've been primarily focused on cartography. For the past 2.5 years or so, I've been making art on my Glowforge Festus here. And if you get that joke, I think we should be friends. This series is not the first time that I've made maps with the laser cutter, but it is the first time I decided to try and tell a story with it. That story started with a question. And that question was, there we go, what's going to happen to my house when sea levels rise? Now, at the time I was living in DC, I was pretty much living on a high point, and I figured that answer was going to pretty much be nothing, but I was still curious. So I looked at a couple of visualizations, the first one being NOAA's sea level rise viewer, which goes up to 10 feet. And in this scenario, pretty much nothing comes to my house. My office was going to be near a lake, but that's okay, right? Surging Seas is an international visualization, and this one really shocked me. Oh my goodness, it'd be so easy for me to walk to the river. And as an artist, I thought, I really need to make art with this. I need to share this. But then I stopped because I work in conservation. And one thing that I have learned is that it's really easy for conservationists to be dismissed as alarmist. So I thought to myself, okay, what does a reasonable worst case scenario look like? That's really different depending on what model you're looking at and what the time frame is going to be. I went and read a few papers, and they really focused on including ice sheet and glacial melting. And one thing that I noticed that kept coming up was that 2 meters by 2100 was within the realm of possibility. I liked 2100. I feel like that is a reasonable, tangible time frame, provided we don't screw everything up. There are people alive right now who are going to see 2100. And so great, I have my number. The NOAA data that I planned on using was only available in whole foot increments. So to be even more conservative, I rounded down. So I went back to the viewer and decided to go look at the coast and see what it looks like at 6 feet underwater. So again, I stopped here because I really love bad jokes, and 6 feet under felt like the perfect, appropriate name for the series. There were a lot of cities that would be good candidates for this, but the first 4 that I have done so far, Boston, Charleston, Honolulu, and Key West. My primary criteria was I wanted to feel a visceral reaction. I wanted to just feel, oh, that's horrible. That's so much loss. So how was I going to convey that loss? Well, I had a few things going for me. First is that laser cut maps are nostalgic. They kind of tug at our heartstrings. They're tangible representations of places that we love, whether it's our hometown, a new city that we've adopted, our favorite vacation spot. I also had the visual language of bathymetric charts, which worked great for showing the remaining land masses, the inundated areas, and the original bodies of water. The last thing I wanted to do to help convey this was to allow people to do what I did to answer my question, which was, what's going to happen to my house? So I wanted to set it at what I considered a useful scale, which was to show every road within within the frame. I also decided to exclude labels because I didn't want to deal with any overlap. The first map I did was Boston. There was a serious learning curve here. I did not expect it to take me down the winding road it did, but I was really happy with the result. I decided to continue this aesthetic through the rest of the series, and it was a very validating project because in the end, I showed this to my family over a Zoom meeting, and my cousin asked me to hold it up, and she goes, oh my God, my house is waterfront property. So that was exactly what I needed to continue the series. Charleston was next, which I think is everybody's favorite. I think probably even my favorite because of the detail. It posed its own challenges. One thing I noticed when I was just sort of playing around with it was that the inundation followed streams through the marshlands into populated areas, and I wanted to show that. It added a lot of visual interest to the coastline, but it did cause some issues because if there are too many lines in too close of an area and the laser lingers in one place for too long, it tends to char. So I had to kind of strike a balance there. Honolulu was next. I actually worked on it at the same time as Key West, and they are set at the same scale. And I kind of consider them sister pieces because I wound up cutting them off the same boards. I really like the composition of Honolulu. I like the balance between ocean and dry land. Almost feels a little abstract. I included streams and canals in this one as well, in part because it let me cheat. I was able to break up the land engrave into 4 different pieces so that I didn't have to sit at my laser for 4 hours at a stretch. Key West is the last one, at least so far. I like the contrast with Honolulu because, again, this is an island location with a completely different result. There's not a lot left. Really just a few very dense areas, and Key West is a very dense place in terms of its urban planning. So I almost excluded this one. A friend suggested it to me because he loves the place, and I thought it was a foregone conclusion. But honestly, that's a bad idea to exclude a map from the series. I think intellectually, it's one thing to know that a place is going to get lost, and it's another to actually see it. This was also another validating map because the friend who suggested it let me know that his favorite bar was going to make it just barely. So how do we do this? How do you get from a shapefile to something you can touch? Unfortunately, I can't give you a complete walkthrough. A, we don't have time for that, but B, there are an infinite number of ways to accomplish this, really depending on what software you use. I use ArcGIS for the most part and Illustrator and Map Publisher, but you can do this for free from QGIS and Inkscape. I'm also fully aware that not everybody's going to run out and buy their own laser cutter, nor are they all going to buy a Glowforge. You might be working in a makerspace once that's safe again, or you might be working with a vendor. So there are some things that you can do, but I'm just going to give you the overall process. And then I'm also going to give you some tips. So I start by planning my composition, usually in Photoshop. One thing to keep in mind is your frame, especially if you're working 3-dimension. A lot of frames have a 1/4 inch overlap on each side. So it's important to keep that in mind and don't put anything important or too fragile at the edge of the frame. Next, gather data. Process your data in whichever software you're comfortable with. If you're a map publisher, you can export as shapefiles. If you don't have map publisher, you can just export as an SVG or whatever other vector format you prefer. Design, again, I do this in Illustrator. Design doesn't just include layout, it also includes prepping, working with kerf and working with simplification, which I will get to in a little bit. Actually prepping for the laser, really what that means is getting it in the right format, but also separating it into steps. Strokes, pretty much universally on any laser I've worked with, are cut lines, whereas filled polygons are engraves. And using different colors allows you to decide what gets done first. Then the engrave and cut, which is when I sit back, sort of relax, and really hope that I didn't screw anything up when I prep my file. And then last, assemble. So that might sound simple and straightforward, and in theory it is, and maybe if you've done it 100 times, it could be. But anytime that you are working with fire and natural materials, you're going to wind up with a little bit of uncertainty and things can go wrong. So in terms of tips, I'm just going to give you some of the things that I really wish I would have thought of when I went into this series, totally gung-ho, thinking I knew exactly what I was doing. The first is to accept chaos, especially if you haven't done this before. It's pretty good to assume that it's not going to go exactly the way that you wanted it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You can learn a lot by messing up. You can learn new techniques, new avenues, things you didn't expect, but it can also be an expensive thing because media is expensive. Your time is expensive. And this is especially the case if you're working with a vendor. So to get around that, the best thing I found is to test everything, and I mean everything, and keep track of your results. So like your engrave and cut settings, your kerf, which is the amount of material that gets burned off by the width of the laser. To accommodate that, you essentially make a small buffer. And I find that when I'm working with really detailed coastlines, like I said, when the laser is in one place for a longer time, it cuts off a little bit more. So it takes a bit of experimentation to make sure that you're preserving the level of detail that you want. Color formulas, if you are working with like a non-stock material, it's really bad when you lose these. Ask me how I know. Also, masks are important if you are altering a material. A mask is basically like glorified masking tape. It covers your media and it keeps it safe from smoke and resin damage while it's being engraved. And that's important because depending on what you've done to your substrate, if the mask is too tacky, it can actually pull it up at the end, especially after it's been engraved and the heat affects that tack. Construction techniques. You probably don't have to do this many samples. This was my exploration from Boston, which was a lot. But it's good to know in advance what's going to work and what doesn't. It's good to try a few other things because it might not be what you expected. But I will say one of the best things you can do when you're making a lot of samples is to break it. You learn a lot about breaking your pieces, and you especially learn how to fix your pieces, because there is nothing worse than dropping a big blob of glue in the middle of an open area and not knowing what to do about it when you're working on your final map. And another thing you want to test are the limitations of your media. There's going to be a minimum size that you can cut before it just gets charred and vaporized. So you want to make sure that you're accommodating that. And with that in mind, another thing that I will say about making maps with the laser is to simplify intentionally. This was from another project where I was working with paper cut, and I make a lot of maps of Antarctica. I didn't even really think about it. I just went with the shapefile that I pretty much always use, but it was way too detailed for the material, and it really just burnt the edges way too much. This simplification is obviously pretty extreme, but using MapShaper is not really the best way to simplify for the laser. It kind of turns out geometric. You get kind of unpredictable results that really aren't laser friendly. The laser doesn't think for you. What you see really is what you get. It doesn't interpolate curves. So if you want something that feels natural, you might have to go back in and edit that yourself. So I could give you so many more tips. I could spend an hour on this trying to really go into detail. But the very last tip that I'm going to give you that I really wish I would have known 10 years ago when I started working with lasers is that sticky tack, like this blue stuff, is the best thing. It's really helpful for removing pieces. When you're cutting small pieces, it's on top of what's called a honeycomb bed, which has about 1/4-inch holes in it. So if you lift up your media, all those little pieces can fall into the bed, which is very hard to keep track of and find again. It also lets you separate them because if you've got a lot of small islands, it can easily become the world's worst jigsaw puzzle. And I also found it was great for larger areas, particularly larger pieces with sort of small details or fragile parts, because you're just lifting it up like this, as opposed to trying to twist it and turn it and opening it up to breakage. And another thing that it's really helpful for is sometimes I find that I'm trying to lift it up, my laser hasn't actually cut all the way through. Again, natural materials are unpredictable. So if you've taken your piece out, even if you're using a jig, it's really hard to get it right back into the same place. So lifting it out directly is really helpful and can save you a lot of time. You don't have to sit and engrave the piece all over again. So I love talking about laser cutters, and I love talking about laser cut maps. I'm just about out of time here, so hit me up in the Slack channel. You can also email me any questions that you might have. You can reach out to me on Instagram. I'm really not on Twitter, but and if you're interested in reading a little bit more about this, you can go to my website or view these in the map gallery. So thank you, everybody. It was nice to talk to you, and I hope to see you again next year.